Thank you for joining me today for this presentation about library research and where it fits within evidence-based practice. My name is Ann Dyer. I'm the liaison librarian to the College of Nursing here at the WSU Health Sciences Library, which is physically based in Spokane. And I'm also the director of the library. I hope that you'll reach out to me during or after this presentation for any other questions that you have that will come up during the course of your research. What we're going to cover is first just talking about what library research is, then looking at library information sources and other sources of information. Then we'll get into creating a search, running a search, and finally actually accessing that information. So what is library research? Ultimately, it is simply finding existing information. When I talk about library research, I don't usually mean that it has to happen within the confines of the library, whether the building or the electronic environment of the library, but really just about how do we find the information that already exists that is published or posted or accessible somewhere. Now, in the context of evidence-based practice, we're really talking about finding the best current evidence on whatever your research question is. Now, here's a cycle for evidence-based practice. You're familiar with it already, probably. And library research touches on most of it, but it really focuses on asking the question in a way that we can use to find information, accessing that information, and to some extent then appraising it. We're focused primarily on that acquisition step in this lecture. Now we can take a look at some of the different types of information sources that you might be looking at. I have this split into two columns. One is the type of information, and the second are the different platforms where that information might live. So we can look at monographs, or books is what they're normally called, periodicals or journals, point of care resources that are designed to be used in the clinical setting, guidelines, news, and even data. The different platforms where we might find those include databases or indexes, circulating materials, that means being able to check them out of the library, like books and journals. You can also think about platforms as being format-based, so e-books versus print books. Point of care resources can be themselves platforms in addition to type of information. And then there's also just the open web, all the different websites that we have access to and search platforms. And there are also agency websites, and this is very important, whether they're government-based or other kinds of organizations. These types of agencies often have some very valuable information that we might want to access and would be accessible on the open web or behind a subscription paywall. So those kinds of information are substantially in the library environment, but there's also that open web environment that I mentioned. So now let's talk a little bit about Google and Google Scholar. And really what I mean by this is open web search engines of many different brands, although I know that Google and Google Scholar are the ones that we use most often. So there are some real benefits to this source of information. For one thing, it's a massive collection, much larger than anything that you would find in any other search platform like the library provides. The second really big benefit is that they work hard to provide relevant search results, what the engineers at Google or at other platforms believe will be most interesting to you. And of course, that means that they have very effective algorithms, which are worth a lot of money. Now, the downsides include that they can't help you cross paywalls. If you come across information that requires any sort of subscription, they won't be able to help you other than by bringing you to that page that then asks you to spend money on it. The flip side to having so much good information in such a large collection is that the results can be simply overwhelming. You might end up with millions of results and no way to really process through those. Then there can be results that it's just hard to appraise the full body of information that you're given. Because there are so many, there are very few filters that you can use to limit that information. It's hard to get a sense of, for instance, what is the state of the research on this topic? You would hope that it would bring you to a page that might do that appraisal for you, but you wouldn't be able to do it easily yourself on a variety of topics. And finally, while those algorithms are very effective and can bring you many relevant results, they're also a bit opaque. We don't know exactly how those decisions are getting made, and we don't know if they're really applicable to our use, especially when what we're looking for is the best current evidence. Is that what the algorithm is trying to bring to us? We don't know, and honestly, probably not, because that may not be the result that the most number of people would be looking for. They might be looking for lower level information, faster information, not necessarily evidence-based information. So now let's think about some of the benefits of using library resources. These are resources that are subscribed to and provided by your institution's library. In this case, really the WSU Health Sciences Library. For one thing, it's important to remember that information has value. So oftentimes, really high quality information has a high price tag associated with it. And that's something that the library realizes and has paid on your behalf to access. It means that you don't have to cross those paywalls because you're already a member of our organization. The second is that structure is your friend. Our library databases have an enormous amount of structure behind them in terms of the metadata and the ability to search them, and you can use that to your advantage in a way that you can't in a Google search. It allows you to assess the information landscape because of that structure. So you can specify levels of evidence that you want to find, or you can quickly see when different articles were published, how much was published at different times. And with practice, it can be easier to use the library database than another more open search. And it can even become easier than a Google search with time. It does become easier, even though there's a little bit of a learning curve up front. Now let's jump into the skills and techniques that you'll need to build a good search. Here, I've translated a PICO question into the beginnings of a search string. So I took this example from a Cochrane review where they're looking at the effects of immediate or early skin-to-skin contact for healthy newborn infants compared to standard contact on establishment and maintenance of breastfeeding and infant physiology. So what I did was just to pull out the population, the intervention, the comparison, and the two outcomes that are mentioned in our question. But we don't want to be limited just to the words that were in our exact question. We also want to think about some other words that might be useful in pulling up relevant information. That's because the words that we use may not be the same words that are used in an article, even if they mean basically the same thing. We don't want to be caught short because of an arbitrary word choice, either on the part of authors or ourselves. So consider some additional synonyms that you might use for these different keywords that we're going to be searching. But in addition to synonyms, also think about some of the broader words that you would use to describe a condition, maybe a broader class of illnesses or something like that. And also consider some of the narrower terms. So you might look for a class of drugs, but also very specific brand names that might be more specific than you're really looking for, simply because if somebody's talking about a specific facet of your question, you don't want to lose sight of it just because your question might apply more broadly as well. Now, that doesn't mean that you want everything broad and everything narrow and every synonym. You'll want to be a little conscientious about what will really help you get the answer to your question. What breadth or what narrowness would be beneficial for your search? What synonyms would be beneficial? And this is also where we're going to come up with these words. We're going to brainstorm them, but we also won't use all of them. We're going to be playful with how we construct the search. So we want kind of a deep bench of possible terms, and we'll figure out through a little bit of trial and error which ones are really pulling up the most relevant results. Now that we have looked at building some of our synonyms and keywords, starting to put together that search, I also want to highlight a facet of database searching that will be extremely useful for you. And that's a piece of metadata called subject headings. Subject headings are essentially a dictionary of terms that a database uses to describe what each article is about. These are the official descriptors that can be applied to each article, and each article will have any number of subject headings applied to it. So, for instance, it might be about newborns, it might also be about breastfeeding, it might also be about skin contact. Now, each database will have its own set of terms. Sometimes they're shared between different ones, and oftentimes there's strong similarities between them, but we need the exact term in each database in order for it to be useful. And we can actually search based on this field. So if we know that the term used is breastfeeding, we can look for breastfeeding in the subject headings field of the article, so that we pull up all of the articles where it has been determined by the indexers of that database, the people working there, that this article is about breastfeeding. It doesn't just mention it, it doesn't just use the word, but it really is the subject, at least to some extent, of the article. Now, you can use these subject headings to do your search, but they can be used either on their own, so that you're searching just in the subject headings field of each article, or you can use them with other keywords. So you could look for breastfeeding as the subject heading while simultaneously searching for kangaroo care just as a keyword. And those keywords are searching all of the metadata of the articles, sometimes even the full text as well. And so kangaroo care might appear in the title or in the abstract of the article, and we'll pull that up. We'll also make sure that breastfeeding is listed as one of the subject headings there. And so we could use a whole series of subject heading terms, we could use a mixture of subject headings and keywords, or we could use exclusively keywords. That means that we have a lot of options for what we're searching, and sometimes there will be topics that are just not well represented in the subject headings list of that database. Certainly a database like CINAHL, which is nursing focused, will generally have subject headings that are related to nursing care, and some of those won't show up very well in PubMed, or vice versa. So you'll use the terms that work best, and again, this is why we're going to play around with it some, see which terms work best for us in each of the databases, do a little bit of trial and error, and that's just part of the process. In PubMed, subject headings are called MESH terms, and that stands for medical subject headings. And here's an example of one of those terms. Here we have the term for a newborn, and they use infant, newborn as the MESH term. So let's go through this a little bit and just see the different sections. We can look up this page in what they call the MESH database, so that for every term you can figure out what words they use, and some of this information we're going to go through now. First, you'll see that there's the term up top, bolded, infant, newborn, and then there's a definition of that term. This can be very important in some cases, just to make sure that they mean what we mean by the term. Here, it's an infant during the first 28 days after birth. Then we have subheadings. These are modifiers of the term. And so you could modify the term with any of these. So perhaps we're interested only in the immunology of newborns or in the physiology of newborns. Usually I leave this blank because that's very limiting to get that specific. I keep it a little bit broader. You can also restrict it to only a major topic, something that the article is significantly about. And you can also ask that it not include any of the narrower terms beneath it in the hierarchy. These terms are arranged in a hierarchy, so you can see over on the right how this one falls. It's a narrower term compared to just any infant, but it's more general compared to a low birth weight infant, a post-mature infant, a premature infant, or even an extremely premature infant. On the bottom left of this slide, you can also see what are called entry terms. This is a list of words where if you search for these words as keywords in PubMed, it will automatically map to this MESH term. So for instance, it might search for newborns. It'll look for that as a keyword. That will work. But it will simultaneously search for infant, newborn in the MESH field of each record. This is really helpful for making sure that it's finding things that it thinks you mean by your search. PubMed is a relatively smart database. It's pretty good at figuring out what you're looking for. So it does this automatic term mapping even when you're using keyword searching. That's a benefit. It can also mean that sometimes it gets it wrong and goes a little bit askew. But you can always take a look in your search history and see how it translated your use of a keyword into other versions of the same keyword and also into the mesh term. So if you're surprised by your results, it's often good to go into that search history, see what they actually searched behind the scenes, and you can make some adjustments from there based on what they did and then what the actual search results turned out to be. Now here we have what CINAHL subject headings look like. It's a different interface. They don't have quite the same page of information on each, but the structure is very similar in that it's arranged as a hierarchy with broader terms leading to narrower terms further down the tree. Here the term happens to be the same between them, infant, newborn. You can see it here in the list in the hierarchy provided. In order to look at the definition, CINAHL provides what they call a scope note. It's that little speech bubble on the right-hand side of the page. It includes something akin to a definition, but often it also has some other recommendations for which terms to use in which situations. So here we would be able to put a check mark next to this term and add it to our search builder in order to use it in a search, or we simply know that that's the term that's used and we can use it more manually as well. Now we're switching gears just a little bit to talk about some specific search techniques. And again, we're getting back to that structure piece of databases. So we have looked at our keywords, we've thought about what we're searching, we've also even used some of the structure provided by subject headings. But these are modifiers and things that adjust how a search works in the search bar. First is using parentheses. Searching in a database is kind of like a math equation. If you remember PEMDAS from earlier math classes, you can use parentheses to kind of cordon off a portion of your search and make sure that it's working correctly with the other parts. We'll do a little demonstration of this coming up. The second is phrase searching. That's using quotation marks around a multi-word phrase to make sure that it is searched together as a phrase. Truncation is using an asterisk or sometimes another symbol in order to indicate that there can be any ending to the word. So here truncation could have an ED at the end or an S or any number of other endings. Next is wildcard. That's where you use perhaps a pound sign or another symbol in order to indicate that something inside a word could be varied or different. This is often helpful for different spellings, especially between British and American English or things like that. And finally, we have what we call Boolean operators. That's a big and fun word that just describes the words and, or, and not. And those help us combine or exclude terms in helpful ways. I'll go into that in the next slide a little bit more. Now, of note, different databases use these different search techniques differently. So for the ones that we're focusing on here, CINAHL and PubMed, all of these work well in CINAHL, but because PubMed is a little bit more fancy with how it translates searches and does that automatic term mapping that we talked about already, I recommend that if you're doing a PubMed search, just stick to using the parentheses and the Boolean operators rather than using the quotation marks, truncation, or wildcard features. You can use them in that database. It does work, but it prevents automatic term mapping from happening. So while you might think that you're broadening a search by saying that any ending on the word would be fine, it might prevent some of the background work from happening of mapping it to the mesh term that's related or doing any other adjustments to your keywords. Now that might work well. You might find yourself needing to do that and prevent the automatic term mapping. That's fine. That will be a conscious choice that you make. But I did want to bring that up so that you don't accidentally prevent some of the features that PubMed comes with. Now, here's the promised slide about Booleans. This is a visual description of how these words change a search. So especially if you like to see things illustrated, here it is for you. I have an example here where we're looking at influenza, flu, and vaccine. So these are our keywords that we're using. And depending on how I use my parentheses and my booleans, I'll get very different search results. In the first instance, we have influenza or flu and vaccine. So we're okay with either the word influenza or flu appearing in all of our search results, but either way, it needs to be paired with the word vaccine. So you can see that we're getting pretty narrow search results there. The second one, I've adjusted where those parentheses are, so the flu word can appear, or the combination of vaccine and influenza. And we get some really odd search results there if what we're trying to find is information about flu vaccines. We're getting a lot about flu that has nothing to do with vaccinations. And finally, we have another version of this where we might be looking at vaccine and influenza, or influenza and flu, lacking anything about vaccines, or vaccine and flu. So we get some of the same search results that we get in that first illustration on the far left, but now we're also getting some irrelevant results that have to do with influenza or flu, but not with vaccinations related to those. This is just important because it helps you imagine how you're drawing the search results out. We want our search results to be as specific as possible so that you get only relevant results, but also broad enough to pull in everything that is relevant. You are never going to have the perfect balance between those. If you're so specific that you have nothing irrelevant, you're also going to miss some relevant results. And if you're broad enough to include everything that could possibly be relevant, you'll also be pulling in information that is not relevant, and perhaps quite a lot of it. That's, again, why we play with it. We do a little bit of trial and error to figure out how can we hit a bit of a sweet spot. And what the sweet spot is will itself change depending on what type of research you're doing, what kind of results you need to get, and what the stakes are of your question. We're ready now for some examples of search strings that we've put together. For a caveat here, these are not perfect examples. There's a lot for and against each one of these, and there are lots and lots of other ways to put them together. But for the first one we're using the mesh term for infant, newborn, and kangaroo care, and breastfeeding or temperature. So here with our PICO question, we have the population, we have the intervention, and we have a potential 2 outcomes. This is one that I would use in PubMed potentially because it uses the mesh term. And you'll also see that I did not use quotation marks around the phrase kangaroo care because I expect that PubMed will likely map me to the correct mesh term, maybe even find some other synonyms based on the phrase kangaroo care. It will likely recognize that as a phrase and not just search for kangaroos. Of course, also with the caveat that it might pull up information about kangaroos and information about other kinds of care. And you can see those 2 different outcomes are listed. I'm okay with either one showing up. So I might be looking at breastfeeding outcomes, and I also might be looking at temperature regulation outcomes. Our next example is a very different kind of search. I've used a few more of the search techniques that we went through a couple slides ago. And this is one that only uses keyword terms. It does not use any of the subject headings like mesh terms. So here I'm looking for healthy and newborn or neonate and full term as a phrase. That's really getting at our population. We want healthy, newborn, full term infants for our PICO question. Next, we also want all of our search results to include either kangaroo care as a phrase or skin to skin as a phrase. And finally, we want breastfeeding, temperature, or perhaps glucose as our outcomes. You can see I use that truncation for breastfeeding, so it could be breastfed, breastfeed, breastfeeding, anything like that. So that's one that I might use in CINAHL because it uses those additional search techniques. And again, I could really change all of this up depending on which subject headings are working well for me, how many outcomes I want to try and include in the search, and any number of other results based on what we see coming up in our search results. Articles come with a lot more metadata than just the subject headings. All of the fields about the article are part of the metadata, like the title, the publication, the date that it was published, the language that it's in potentially. And so we can use this metadata to also filter our results so that we can really narrow what we're finding. This is separate from the search string that we're using, although there are some ways to use search strings in a similar way. But in many databases, you will be able to limit by the date of publication. So within the last 5 years, for instance, we may be able to limit by language. In some of them, you can also limit by study type. Like PubMed has a lot of different study types. CINAHL, you can limit at least to randomized controlled trials. CINAHL also allows you to limit by peer review, as well as different age groups that are studied. So keep in mind that these filters will be a really big benefit to you in your searching. So if you pull up a number of search results, you might have, for instance, 200 results. By limiting down by date range, by study type, you might have just a handful left, and that's a lot more manageable to work through. And if those are your criteria for selecting an article, then you just don't have to wade through the rest of them. I will add that one of the available filters in most databases is to limit to just the articles that we have full text available for. I have this struck through on the slide because I recommend wholeheartedly that you not use this filter, at least not here at WSU, where we have such a variety of databases and resources to pull from. While many of our databases have full text of articles within them, a database is just a collection of resources. We also often find ourselves with a citation, but no full text. And that might seem not helpful, but the purpose of a database is in part to just help you find the information. So now you know this article exists, you might know that you want to have access to it. And you'll be able to find this article in many cases through one of our other databases. So for instance, we might find a citation to it in PubMed and find full text for it in CINAHL. And we have so many various databases that can be the case through a lot of different resources that we have access to. If you limit to full text within a database, it will not know whether we subscribe to a different database that may be owned by a different company within our collections. So you're arbitrarily limiting your search results significantly if you use that filter. In addition, as the library, it's our responsibility to actually go out and find the articles for you that we don't have as part of our collection. That's a process called interlibrary loan, and I'll show you how to access those through our demonstration. But it's our job to find them. So just with a citation, you can let us know that you want the article, and we'll work on our end to go get it from another library on your behalf. Here I've illustrated a way of thinking of the library landscape. We have a lot of different databases and indexes and the physical collection. And these are all separate. They're subscribed to separately. But we do provide basically the library catalog in order to find resources across all of these different resources. Now we call this piece of software a discovery layer, and that is called Searchit on WSU campuses. You may have come across Searchit before. It does include all of our physical holdings like the traditional library catalog, but it also then looks at our databases and indexes to find what articles we have electronically through those subscriptions. An index is very much like a database, but technically it doesn't include the full text within it. So some of our resources are indexes, some of them are databases, and probably most of them are a little bit of a combination of both. I've pulled this page from the book Hand, Hand, Fingers, Thumb. It's one that I always think of when I think about our library landscape, that it's a little bit chaotic. There are a lot of different monkeys that we're working with here, those different databases, lots of different rhythms simultaneously. And we go into the separate databases because things are much more findable by going into the separate databases rather than using Searchit to look across all of them. But we use Searchit in order to find usually known items. So if you have a citation from one database and you're trying to find full text in another, we use Searchit in order to look up that citation and see if we have it elsewhere. The moral of that story is that you can expect to find citations in one database, like CINAHL, and then access the full text in a completely different database. Now, you're often expected to report what database you found something in, and from a library perspective, that's a hard thing to do because the question is just, are we asking where the citation was found, or are we asking where the full text was accessed? And usually the question is really getting at where did you find the citation? How did you discover that this article exists? So that would be potentially in CINAHL, even if you ended up accessing the full text in, for instance, ScienceDirect or another database. This is just something to keep in mind. That's a normal part of the process to kind of jump between our various resources. Now, before we jump into a demonstration of these databases, I do want to talk briefly about some of the ethical and practical considerations of your search. We touched briefly on breadth versus narrowness. You want to keep in mind that the results that you get will be different depending on how broad or narrow your results are. The question that you're asking, the broadness or the specifics of the question, to some extent dictate what results are available to you. So, for instance, if you're asking a very narrow question, you will probably find a very narrow answer, and that may not take into account very relevant information about something that is perhaps just to the side of the question that you asked. Highly related, but not about the specific, the niche. And so you can end up with information that seems very high quality, but you're missing a big part of the picture. And similarly, you could ask a very broad question and end up missing a lot of the nuance of the specific situations that you might come across. Now, again, this is about finding the sweet spot, and the sweet spot is constantly changing. So you'll need to consider with each clinical question that you're asking, how broad should you go on this? How narrow should you go? And perhaps even play around with that. Search very broad terms, search very narrow terms, see how the results change, and make an informed choice from there. Next, ask whether your question is matching the study type that you're finding. There will be questions that you ask, good evidence-based questions, for which there simply cannot be an ethically produced randomized controlled trial. Or practically, you might not be able to find that high level of evidence. For example, if you're looking for information about how people are affected by natural disasters, you can't, either practically or ethically, put a whole group of people in the path of a Category 5 hurricane and just see what happens. But you can do other types of studies, perhaps where you're looking retrospectively at the group that happened to interact with that natural disaster and then drawing results from other information sources about how their health and other issues progressed. So consider how your question might dictate the kind of study types that you are hoping to find. Don't try to find study types that simply can't exist, and do hold the study types to a high standard when those can exist. And finally, do ask whether you can get access to the paper. I know I was just talking about how you don't want to limit your results arbitrarily. And in most cases, while you're at WSU, the answer to this will be yes, you can. But you might need to work ahead a little bit because an interlibrary loan process might take a little bit extra time. So I always say you want to research early and often to make sure that you will be able to get access to all the papers that you need for your work. And there may be some papers that you can't get access to. That especially might include papers that are not yet published. Sometimes it's especially frustrating when you find an abstract for a conference presentation because those may not have an associated full text paper. It just wouldn't exist. So just consider the practicality of what you can get access to. We're going to jump now into some actual live demonstrations of searching these databases. Let's start in PubMed. First, start from the Health Sciences Library website and scroll down to click PubMed. This will bring you into our edition of it. And I'm going to jump straight into the MeSH database so that I can look up some of the terms that I'd like to use. I'll start by seeing what they use for infant, take a look at some of the options they have. Let's start with infant. And then I can take a look at some of the narrower terms and choose infant newborn. That's really what I want to use. So I can see the information about that term. I think I'll use it. So I click Add to Search Builder as I start to build my actual database search. Next, let's take a look for another one of our terms. Here we'll use kangaroo care. They actually use kangaroo mother care method. I'll add that to my search builder. And then I'm going to look for information about breastfeeding, which is one of our outcomes. A couple of options. Looks like this is the one that I want to use. You can see it comes up a couple times in that hierarchy. Add it to my search builder again, and let's see what we get. They added "and" in between each of those terms. I get 182 results, it looks like, and I'll go ahead and limit to 5 years using those limiters on the left-hand side of the screen. I'm also going to select some high levels of evidence. I'd like to see randomized controlled trials, maybe some meta-analysis. I'm also fine with a systematic review. Now I'm down to just 18 results, which is much more manageable. So I'll take a look for one that looks interesting to me, click on the title, and it will bring me into information about that article. Now as you scroll down, you'll see good information. One is similar articles, some cited by information, that's articles that were published since this one that cited it. You'll also see those other mesh terms that we could use to build our own collection. There's a cite button. You can change which format you use. Just be careful because the capitalization is often wrong in those. Then I use that Find It at WSU button. It brings me into Search It actually, and it looks like we don't really have it yet. So I click Sign In, enter my username and password, and then I can request the item. This is all you need to do for interlibrary loan. Click Send, and then it will send you an email as soon as the PDF of that article is ready. I'm going to take another look at my search results, scroll down a little bit, see what other ones are available. Let's take a look at this one. Here's another article, same types of information, and I click Find It at WSU, hoping that we can get this article in full text. Now, here it is. We have it. There's the text of it. In this case, we can get the PDF up at the top of the article. That's always in a little different place in each one of the databases we have access to. But here's the full text of the article that we wanted to use. Now, I used all of my mesh terms there. I could also change it up and do just a keyword search. You'll see I'm not even using quotation marks because we're in PubMed here and we want to have that automatic term mapping. And when I search, the filters that I previously applied have been remembered. Going into your search history under Advanced, then you can take a look at how it was actually translated into the search. So my search, then what it actually searched behind the scenes, and you can see how it translated each one of my terms into a lot of different versions. Now I can break that automatic term mapping, break those translations by putting the quotation marks around it. Again, I click Advanced, that brings me into my search history, take a look at the details. And it did translate 2 of my terms, but it no longer translates kangaroo care. And I got many fewer results, about 30 fewer, just by making that little change. So that's the basics of searching PubMed. You got to see using mesh terms, keywords, accessing the full text of the article, citing the article, and a few other features in those PubMed records, and importantly, how to then go see what was searched behind the scenes, and that will help you make decisions about how you search moving forward. Okay, now let's do the same type of search, but in CINAHL. CINAHL stands for the Cumulative Index for Nursing and Allied Health Literature, and it's one of the key databases in the field of nursing. Starting from the library website again to scroll down and click CINAHL, you'll see immediately that there are 3 search bars in CINAHL, and these search bars basically just work as parentheses. It just provides it for you. There are also lots of other additional advanced features down below which you can absolutely use, and I recommend checking out, and that's where you can use some of the filters right away. I've started with a keyword search here, and I'm going to go ahead and limit down to the previous 5 years so that I'm going to cut my results significantly that way. I'll take a look at some of the other features here. I'm going to limit by the subject, and here I want kangaroo care to show up. That really does limit my results significantly to begin with, which is a helpful technique. In CINAHL, I can also limit by age, so I can limit just to those newborn babies. That's going to be a much more manageable set of search results. I'm going to click on number 2 here. That looks like an interesting result. It brings me to the full HTML text, and I can switch over to the PDF using that button on the left. On the right-hand side, I can find the permanent link to this. This is the URL that you would use to get back to this page in the future. And there's the citation button. A little bit different looking, but same idea. You can use the APA citation, but double check it for accuracy. You can also click the detailed record on the left side there. That's where I find all the metadata for this article instead of just the full text. Now I'm headed back into my search results here so that I can take a look at yet another article. I'll choose the first one, and it does not bring me to full text immediately, but over on the left there's a Find It at WSU button. That brings me into Search It to try and find the article. And here it's not bringing me directly into the article. Instead, it's bringing me to a record of it within Search It. Down below, I can see that there's a database that's linked to that should have it. I click through, and yes, there it is. I can view the PDF as well. Sometimes it will bring you straight to the article. Sometimes you need that extra step to get through Search It. I've clicked CINAHL subject headings up at the top to get into their thesaurus. Starting by looking for newborn infants, I can see where it falls in the hierarchy, check that. I'm going to explode the term, meaning that I'll look for any narrower terms as well, and ensure that it's a major concept. Then I go on to browse additional terms. It will remember what I've selected, and now I'm looking for kangaroo care. Here's what we're looking for. I'm going to verify with the scope note that this really is what I'm looking for. Looks good to me. Click on the title there so that I can view where it falls in the hierarchy, and it's there a couple of times actually, not just once, but it's all the same term. So now it's added to my search. I am going to make sure it's a major concept, but I can't explode it because that's the narrowest term. And I've also asked it to combine these terms using and instead of or. Now finally, I'm going to look for that breastfeeding term. And it tells me that they use breastfeeding as 2 separate words. They even note that if I want breastfeeding to use it as 2 separate words. Again, I can verify the scope, which gives me a little definition. I'll click into it and see where it falls in the hierarchy. It does have some narrower terms. So again, I'll check that one. It adds it to my search, and I can say that I want it to be a major concept, and I want to explode that term and include the narrower terms below it. Once I've done that, I can search the database. I'm down to just a few number of results here. That's very manageable. It does not, though, remember my filters. So I go ahead and update the date field so that I'm down even further. And again, I can click into a title. This one does have the full text. So once again, I've gotten to the full text of the article that I'd like to use. Thank you for joining me for this presentation. I know those database demonstrations were very quick, so I strongly encourage you to go in and try your own Pico search, play with those keywords, and try to find the most beneficial subject headings, whether mesh terms in PubMed or subject headings in CINAHL, in order to get the search results that you're looking for. I've included my email address down here below. Please do reach out with any questions that you have about your own research. I can always get into further depth about how these databases work and how to get the most out of them. And we can also work together on identifying the best search terms in order to answer your question.